another episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer. I have a very special guest on the show with me tonight. And it's someone that I've wanted to have on the show for a while now, actually, since I had the pleasure of landing this gig. And I think the timing now is perfect for this individual to be on the show. And I want to welcome to the show Olivia Nuamah. Thank you for being with us this evening, Olivia. I really appreciate it.
Randy, it's a pleasure to be here. It's always a pleasure to be talking to you, for sure. I'm, a huge fan, as you know, and it's a real delight to talk to you.
Well, that feeling is absolutely mutual. I just want to let the audience know a little bit about you. Olivia is actually the most recent and now former executive director of Pride Toronto. But even more importantly, Olivia is a community builder, a social activist. And I think at the top of that list, and I say this as a parent myself, Olivia is a mother. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted you on the show tonight as well, Olivia. Obviously, as a clear Black woman in the world today, we're seeing so much discourse and quite frankly tragedy happening out there, and that has got to affect you not only as a queer person, as a Black person, and as a mother. I mean, you're getting this from all the angles, right? And I think I want to start this discussion with you, just like I probably would if I saw you on the street. How are you? What's going on with you? How are you feeling and dealing with all of this that's going on? And while it's come to the forefront now, I absolutely recognize that this is something that's been going on, for centuries. But the fact that it's now so prominent and that white folks like me are actually talking about it now too, how are you feeling? How are you right now?
That's a really good question. And I oscillate, to be honest with you, between anger and an extreme feeling of upset. And obviously personal fear. I think first on the kind of extreme feeling of upset, there is nothing quite like watching unfold before your eyes somebody die at the hands of the services that were meant to protect them. Mm-hmm. And so in that sense, it's incredibly heart-wrenching for me, but not necessarily because, even though it's important that there are a lot of Black men at the moment Black men all over the world are under siege. And I, as a mother of two boys myself, it is a part of the story I talk to people about. It is as much theoretical for me because I have dedicated my life to the work of trying to highlight issues as they affect particularly Black men, because it's personal to me in my life outside of my own children. Obviously, I come from a huge family, and my family is dominated by boys and men, and so it's incredible to have spoken about this for as long as I have in an attempt to try to suggest that it is time that we start to try to think about what the solution is before more Black men and Black people, just more broadly, before more of them die. And it has not been an easy life doing that. As I reflect, I didn't think so, actually, until the last 2 or 3 months, but I feel a huge sense of grief and loss. But that's also coupled with this sense of, it's funny how it all comes back to you. I've spent my whole professional life reading about, trying to understand the Black condition. There's no place there's no stone I've left unturned. And most of it, I kind of thought I had, as our brains do, what you learn, you kind of forget. you
Sure.
know?
Yeah.
It's never really been like alive for me in real life until now. So I suppose, I'm a student of Black history as it applies to the West and the North American context. And so it is the most emotional thing for me is to watch things happen today that have happened in history, and to be able to make the connection between, and I read history as though it is a bygone time. It's
Sure.
I just know about what happened, and all of a sudden I find all of this knowledge like appearing out of nowhere because it has all happened before. And so,
and what you see as history is, I mean, we're living it now, right? What we thought was historical acts of violence are acts of violence that are no longer historical, but they are completely relevant today. And not only are we hearing about it, but we're seeing it. We are witnesses. All of us are witnesses with social media and the advances of technology and cameras that people carry around with them as their telephones. We are all witnesses to the realities of what's going on in the world. So it's not just history anymore we're looking at. It's the reality of what's happening today.
Randy, it's so interesting that you use the word witness. And I'll tell you why it's interesting, because we perhaps had to watch a man go from life to death. And yet it is everywhere all the time. And it's a moment of reckoning that this has been my reality. It isn't for it, you are bearing witness to what has been happening regularly.
Right.
Because nobody was looking, even though we were saying it's happening now. These families do not deserve to be going through this. We must do more now.
Yeah.
And you're right. But we know that the issue of Black men as they engage enforcement services, I mean, we know, right?
Absolutely.
To how many, from the Philando Castiles to Trayvon Martin to all of those names, but because nobody had a camera phone, somehow it wasn't witnessed then. It was their life and my life. And now that somebody, and again, the camera phone is so interesting because Eric Garner, we watched this man on a camera phone be completely abused to his death. We watched him be violently restrained. And yet that didn't necessarily have the impact. Like it's like the kind of trying to understand what has been being said all along, and what has happened now, and why this and now, as opposed to every other time. And of course, there's that. And then there's also this recent shooting in Atlanta. So you have the George Floyds who do absolutely nothing. And then you have the Black men who actually might do something, who are running away and getting shot in the back and then kicked while dying, only then for us to have a conversation about, well, that guy, he tased the police and he did this, so, he deserved to die, basically is the long and short of it. And that, it isn't a bearing witness. We clearly have opinions about which Black men deserve to die and which ones don't, based on how they engage with the police. We actually do have very strong narratives. We do feel like we have a lot of knowledge about, how our lives, how all of our lives play out in relation to, our deaths. And yet the sense that there's some kind of newness to it is almost what is, it's beyond frustrating, right? If you think about 2016 and Pride, Black Lives Matter and all of that, everybody was on our side, right? And yet, it continues as such. And every time it happens, it's oh my gosh, look at this. When in fact, as a queer community, we've been talking about this for a long time.
Well, yeah, and as I mentioned before at the top of the show, before we went to air, when you and I spoke last week, there's been names added to that list even since then. We have, and it's Black men, it's Black trans women,
Yep.
It's indigenous folks, and it's
it all, right? All of a sudden.
And I wanted to ask you because you're right. We are witnessing this now. It's gone on for centuries. What do you think the impact has been of the COVID-19 pandemic and the fact that, there are so many people now that have had their lives put on pause and aren't working and are staying at home and have access to watch it. So there's no distraction, I guess. There's no excuse not to see what's going on. Whereas before, we could just, I've got work to do. I'm going back to work, so my life goes on. But because my life is paused now to a certain extent, this has been sort of, it's really hit home. And I'd like to think that's why we are seeing, more and more white folks coming out to these protests and rallies, and in some cases actually leading these rallies. So there's almost a wokeness that's happening. And I'm wondering, from your perspective, what do you think that COVID-19 has had on that impact of us being more woke and aware and starting to actually finally do something about it? And I say that is a generalized we for the entire white population, myself included, because you're right. I've seen it, I've watched it, and haven't done nearly enough. And I hope this is the beginning. I commit to you as a friend, this doesn't end for me. This is something that will continue. And I think you know me well enough that when I have a passion around something, I will pursue it like nothing else. And as much as I have a passion around the advocacy and activism work that I do in the HIV community and in the queer community in general, that same passion has got to come from me personally, taking a step back and reflection and pausing and realizing, you know what, this can't go on. I don't want to hear another name like Regis Krasinski-Paquette and George Floyd and Rayshard Brooks and all these other names of people who have died, been murdered needlessly. It's just, I can't fathom it. And again, just to get back to that question and stop my rambling, because I want to hear from you. COVID-19, has that pause in the world stage helped to illuminate what's going on?
It has, it's COVID has been so certainly if you are, if you are not, if you have means, if you aren't economically and socially marginalized, you do have an opportunity to stop and think about what is happening around you. And absolutely, it has utterly contributed to the outpouring on the streets, the demonstrations, the sense that COVID or no COVID, racism is a bigger pandemic, and you see people putting themselves on the line personally, putting their personal health on the line to make a point about what is happening to communities of color around the world when they are minorities in majority countries. And so absolutely, full stop. And it's been, I have to say, one of the things I have found most moving is the fact that it hasn't taken, your Black friend to go with you or to lead a protest for you to go out and decide, regardless of what my, Black friends, neighbors, coworkers think, what I think is going to matter now. I'm not going to be led by anything but my own conscience. And I have been, and all over the world, you see it, like the massive, massive numbers. And the symbolism of these huge white crowds saying that's not right. And it is not, and obviously for them, it's the manifestation of the very same thing in their own countries, right? So the first thing we understand is that the Black experience internationally is one of subjugation, marginalization, and certainly economic constraints. So that's a thing, and yes. But what we also see from the pandemic is that not a lot of communities of color have an opportunity to sit around and reflect, have an opportunity to, garden and wonder, have an opportunity to take that space. If you have children, if you are living in, smaller or cramped conditions and overcrowded conditions, if you are, and you will be, an essential, effectively low-wage earner, you are going to work every single day.
Right.
You're not in a position to take a stop. If you are a new immigrant to this country, you are absolutely don't have the networks to hold yourself up socially. So let's be clear that the pandemic for white people. And you know what? Not just white people. I'm employed. I have all of the trappings of no longer being poor. So it's in that sense. I'm not talking about myself, but we don't see that for communities of color, right? We see
Sure.
that they're the essential workers. We see that they are the grocery store workers. We see that
Right.
they're getting up and going to work every day. And
Which makes the responsibility even more evident that it needs to fall on those of us who have that privilege to speak up and do the work.
absolutely, and absolutely, and that's exactly what we've seen. And you see that it is incredibly moving, and you see what happens when people who are not people of color get together and decide that, like, okay, we need to do more than just have a friend and feel bad daily.
Right.
And so absolutely, the pandemic, though, for me has been less about the opportunities to reflect and more about the kind of clear showing of evidence that distribution is unequal, and particularly unequal when it comes to communities of color. That's really what, from policing, as you've seen, who
Right.
gets policed under these circumstances, but from access to health, to all of the things
Sure.
that keep you safe, that doesn't apply to this community. And so from the get-go, we have to imagine that we are living in two different worlds.
Yeah, and so I can only imagine that, we talk about anti-Black racism and ending these prejudices, and not just equality, but equity for all. And I would venture that while those are great concepts, I would think, and correct me if I'm wrong, I would think to many in the Black community that would almost seem like a utopian view. Is that really something that you see as achievable? Can we actually, I think we can do better, but can we sustain it and make sure it's a lasting difference that really has an effect on people who are marginalized and racialized and Black and indigenous and trans folks? And can this be something that can turn into a reality?
I hope so. I hope so. Maybe you catch me in pessimistic mood today, maybe on another day. But I think it's hard to undo the shackles of history. And I think that what the conversations that we're all having today are very much, I don't even know how to describe how it is that one comes, that one sees that equality that you just described. I just don't know. I've never seen it in my lifetime. I've never experienced it. And that is through being, and I am a gainfully employed, educated person who, et cetera, et cetera. It just applies differently in my life.
Right.
And it's just applied differently through my life, depending on, what age I am and what's happening to me. What I do feel quite sincerely is that I don't know how I am, I not be the person that lives my life daily with, engaging with people who look at me differently. I don't know how those people who look at me differently, I don't know how it is they look at me in a different way, let's say. I don't know how that happens. Because I've never experienced it, to be truthful with you. And I don't know anybody who has. And so maybe I'll know it when I see it, but right now I am more feeling like the only thing that can happen at the moment is that we start to understand the aspects of the system that is meant to support us, that we start to understand what aspects of those systems are the most detrimental and start to address those immediately. And Randy, you mentioned your activism in HIV. And HIV and the whole HIV movement is such an inspiration to me and to so many like us. Why? Honestly, I don't know if when activism started around HIV, whether I ever thought I'd be in the place I'm in right now, looking, where you are helpfully and happily living and you are undetectable from the time when this started to now. I don't know if then you could have dreamt, even you, Randy, right? I know you could have dreamt that you are where you are now.
Absolutely.
And here you are. Do you know what I mean? And so I know change is possible. And when I think about the prejudices outside of skin color, when I think about those prejudices and I think about how I never imagined that somebody HIV positive can walk down the street and actually it be a beautiful part of their identity as freedom fighting, right?
Sure.
That kind of trajectory is like I've seen it in HIV. It's possible, but how it happens as it applies to race is, I don't know what that pathway looks like. I'm fighting for it for sure. But I can't, I can't put my finger on what it would, on how it would manifest.
Yeah, and I think, if you want to sort of liken it to HIV activism, it's one of those things that, we talk about how, it's 40 years of the epidemic and we still have so much stigma around folks living with HIV and misunderstanding and misinformation. And when we think about, 40 years of misinformation having to overcome, and we've got centuries
Randy,
to overcome.
as I was talking, that's exactly what I was thinking,
Yeah.
I was thinking the only difference is the length of the history of it all. And you're absolutely right. Absolutely. And, there's so much, there's such a long way to go. And nobody would ever argue that anything like what you're living now is anything like what it should be. But, to be at the point where it is education, because you have been able to ensure that the people that are supporting this community do it right, and that's so that's my blueprint. My blueprint is let's just fight and make sure that everybody around communities of color are doing it right. And when that happens, we can then start to look at that ongoing, never-ending process of education that happens, that maintains that sense of freedom. It's not all the way free, but certainly it's on that pathway to freedom, maybe somewhere closer to the start than it is at the end, but that pathway is clear. And you know exactly the direction you need to go in. And so I am hoping that through all that's happened, that we are also able to create a pathway, and that pathway is clear around how people support communities of color that are at the greatest disadvantage. And when that pathway is clear, then we can start to talk about how we change ongoing education systems to maintain them.
Yeah, and as I said earlier, I think that responsibility unquestionably lies squarely on the shoulders of white folks of privilege like myself, who can affect that change and make sure that there is a recognition of what systemic racism looks like, and not deny it, and recognize it, and again, just take responsibility for it, and then move forward with dialogue to ensure there's change. And I'm getting signals from my producer that we are getting low on time, so I want just final thoughts from you. I know we've talked about what our hopes are, but just if you can sum up in 3 minutes how you're feeling, and what your hopes are, and where you want things to lead. I'd love to hear from you on that.
How I'm feeling is, I'm feeling somewhat more positive than I ever have, to be honest with you, and that's saying something, right? In an age where, nooses, people are dying from hanging themselves from trees, or being murdered that way, or whatever the case may be. One of the things I feel really glad about, in a macabre sort of way, is the understanding that finally I can see the systems through time. I can see how the systems are continually reproducing themselves. I have little belief now in this notion of this watershed change. I don't walk down the streets any longer, if I ever did, feeling some kind of sense that I am much more accepted today than I was yesterday. I absolutely, my own work, in the sense of what I think and feel, the way in which I have been able to engage in conversations with people who sort of heard what I've thought in the past, who know that I've sometimes felt like I have been, out at sea without anybody around saying, okay, maybe, okay, perhaps, let's see how we can make this into something tangible and real. I am now in the midst of everything I imagined would happen if we continued not to address the systemic issues that plague this community, meaning the Black community. And so in that sense, as much as I am distraught, and daily I am distraught, I am also much more unwavering than I ever was before.
Well, again, I think you're fabulous. I appreciate you taking the time to be with us on the show. I do hope that we can do this again, and Black Lives Matter. Absolutely, 100%. And I will scream that from the rooftops if that's what I need to do, and do the work. I'm committed. I'm committing to you and to my audience, to the listeners, to making sure the work that I can do gets done to the best of my ability. So thank you again, Olivia, for being on the show today. I really, really do appreciate it. And I hope we'll do it again soon.
Randy, you're the best.
Thanks very much. And thanks for watching another episode of Let's Be Perfectly Queer.
Thank you, Randy.